In the autumn of 2020, Azerbaijani forces opened a offensive in Nagorno-Karabakh that ended a generation-long frozen conflict in a matter of weeks. Within the first fortnight, Armenian armored vehicles and air defense systems were being destroyed from above at a rate that surprised almost everyone. Up to 39% of Azerbaijani kills in that war came from drones, and specifically from loitering munitions, a weapon class that had existed quietly since the Israelis built the Harpy in the 1990s suddenly became, for most militaries around the world, the thing to buy. Since then, whether it's Russian Lancets and Iranian Shaheds over Ukraine, Iranian and Houthi loitering munitions over the Red Sea, or more recently over the Gulf, loitering munitions have started the decade as a niche category, have now become household names and one of the most widely deployed new weapons in the world. Pakistan was paying attention. By the time India launched Operation Sindoor on the 7th of May 2020, Pakistan's loitering munition program had expanded to at least 11 distinct systems under development across state-owned enterprises and private firms. Some were indigenous, some were Chinese, and one was the product of a co-development agreement Pakistan had signed in August 23 with Baykar, the Turkish firm behind the TB2 that had such an impact on the war in Nagorno-Karabakh 5 years earlier. That system was the YIHA-III. And when Pakistan retaliated in the 72 hours that followed Sindoor, the YIHA-III was one of the drones Pakistan chose to employ. What happened to it is the subject of today's episode, and what the combined performance of Pakistani and Indian loitering munitions in that conflict taken together tells you about where this whole class of weapon is heading. To do that, I'll work through 6 sections. Pakistan's drone program history and where the YIHA-III fits into it, how loitering munitions are classified and which category the YIHA-III belongs to, the combat record from May 2025 conflict, the global record of loitering munitions, the next generation of loitering munitions, and finally, what Pakistan's realistic options are going forward. Pakistan's drone program and where the YIHA-III fits. Pakistan's drone program is older than most people think. The Pakistan Air Force established its first UAV squadron in 2003. The Jasoos-2 Bravo Plus, a surveillance platform built by the private firm Satuma, was inducted a year later, becoming the first indigenous operational drone in Pakistani service. In 2008, Pakistan Aeronautical Complex at Kamra began assembling the Italian Selex ES Falco from imported kits. That was Pakistan's first medium-altitude, medium-endurance drone. Leonardo, the Italian parent company, restricted the Falco to surveillance only and did not authorize an armed variant, a constraint that shaped how the PAF approached foreign vendor relationships for the rest of the decade. The armed drone breakthrough came from China. In November 2013, Pakistan's National Engineering and Scientific Commission (NESCOM) inducted the CASC-CH-3, license built locally as the Barak. From the Barak, the Bark laser-guided missile was publicly tested in March 2015, and 5 days later, a Barak conducted Pakistan's first confirmed armed drone strike in the Tira Valley. A second followed in North Waziristan in September. Pakistan had joined the Armed Drone Club. What came next was the slow build-out of the indigenous and imported male fleet. NESCOM developed the Sharpa family, the baseline Sharpa in the mid-2010s, the armed Sharpa II, and later the Sharpa III with naval configurations. From 2021 onward, Pakistan diversified its foreign sources. The Chinese CASC CH-4B arrived in January 2021. The Turkish Bayraktar TB2 in April 2022, and the larger Akinci B in 2022-23. By 2025, the PAF was operating Chinese Winglong 2s alongside all of the above. That 3-tier supply structure, Chinese, Turkish, and domestic, was deliberate. It gave air headquarters negotiating leverage against any single source. Loitering munitions were a related development. Serious Pakistani investment in expendable strike systems began around 2023, driven by the operational lessons from the Nagorno-Karabakh and Ukraine. By the time Operation Bunyan-un-Marsoos happened in May 2025, Kuwa's tracking identified 11 distinct Pakistani loitering munition programs at various stages of development, spread across state-owned enterprises and private firms. Kuwa's assessment of that portfolio was blunt. Broad coverage on paper, no single system at meaningful production scale. In their words, design heavy, production light. The 11 programs cluster unevenly across the loitering munition categories. Most are at the tactical end, small, short-range infantry-level systems like the Integrated Dynamics Rover LM and ERAD, the Woot-Tech X-Spear MX-150, and the Cavalier Murtajiz MP-152 and MQ-350. A few sit in the medium-range tier alongside the YIHA-III itself, notably the NASTP Python, which is still in development, and the repurposed Integrated Dynamics Nishan Mk2. At the long-range standoff end, Pakistan's long-range coverage is thin. Cavalier's Murtaj's MP300, a Shahed-class design still in the design phase, and bridging into cruise missile territory, NASTP's Kagem V3, an air-launched mini-cruise munition, which is reportedly closely aligned with Baykar's Kamankesh-2. The distribution matters. Pakistan's tactical loitering munition coverage is reasonable on paper. Its medium-range coverage is thin, and its long-range coverage is still conceptual. The medium-range multi-role category is the one where the YIHA-III had to fill a gap, and Pakistan had several realistic ways to fill it. The PAF could have bought a proven platform, likely from the Chinese medium-range system off the shelf, but a Chinese purchase would have deepened the existing 81% Chinese arms dependency. It could have license-produced an existing design from a willing foreign OEM. Essentially the same arrangement Pakistan already had with the Chinese origin Dark Angel 2 and NASTP. It could also have pursued full indigenous development through NESCOM or the private sector, but none of the domestic programs in that tier were production ready. But what Pakistan ended up doing was co-develop a new platform with a foreign partner. That partner was Baykar. In August 2023, at the inauguration of the National Aerospace Science and Technology Park in Rawalpindi, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Baykar chairperson Selçuk Bayraktar signed a cooperation agreement that placed Baykar's research and development work inside the NASTP facility. This was a first for Pakistan's drone program. Most of the foreign drones Pakistan operates, the CH-3, the CH-4B, the TB2, the Akinci, the Winglong 2, were procured as finished products with varying degrees of local assembly. Co-development is a different institutional arrangement, and two reasons explain why it was chosen here. The first is institutional preference. Air Headquarters has for over a decade favoured keeping drone programs in in-house PAF-controlled entities, chiefly NASTP, rather than subordinating them to NESCOM or accepting finished product procurement. The YIHA-III was meant to be a major product of that preference, a genuine co-development partnership, not a procurement with a license attached. The second is supply chain diversification. Turkey offered an ITAR-free alternative but demonstrated battlefield credibility after Nagorno-Karabakh, and Baykar was willing to offer technology transfer rather than just a finished goods sale. For Pakistan, the YIHA-III was a hedge, the first attempt to build a medium-range loitering munition capability inside Pakistan with a partner other than China. Loitering munition classification and the YIHA-III's design. Before we look at the YIHA-III's design specifically, it's worth stepping back and asking how loitering munitions as a class are actually categorized, because the categories determine what each system was built to do and how those design choices constrain what it can do. The cleanest published taxonomy is Zugan and Degtiarev's 2024 classification. They divide loitering munitions into three operational range bands: tactical up to 50 km, medium range 50 to 150 km, and long range over 150 km. Each band correlates with a distinct set of propulsion, launch, and employment choices. At the tactical end, you find systems like the American Switchblade 300, the Russian Lancet-1 and KU-B UAV, the Chinese CH-901 and BG-201, and the Turkish Kargu. Warheads are typically in the 0.2 to 4 kg range, and they are launched by hand from small catapults or from tube containers carried by individual soldiers. These systems are typically battery-powered with a typical endurance of 30 minutes to 2 hours. Doctrinally, these are an infantry-level asset, a longer-ranged, precision-guided alternative to mortars. The Switchblade 300, by published figures, runs at roughly $60,000 to $80,000 per unit. Medium-range loitering munitions, the class the YIHA-III belongs to, are larger. Launch masses are between 50 and 150 kg, warheads of 5 to 30 kilograms, ranges of 60 to 150 kilometers, endurance of 1 to 4 hours. Propulsion is mostly piston engine with turbojet variants for higher cruise speed. Launch is usually from a catapult or launch rail. Runway launch is unusual for the class. Doctrinally, medium-range loitering munitions are a divisional or core level asset. The tool a military reaches for when it needs to suppress enemy air defenses, strike command and control nodes, or hit fixed targets in the depth of the battlefield without using crewed aircraft. The class is dominated by a smaller number of mature designs from specific industrial bases. the American Jackal, the Chinese WS-43 with its 60-kilometer range and turbojet propulsion, and the Turkish Kamankesh line from Baykar. Russia has historically prioritized the tactical end for its Lancet and KUB programs, and its medium-range coverage in the open literature is thinner. Longer-range loitering munitions are a different category altogether. Systems like the American Hero 900 and Hero 1250 and LOCAS, the Chinese ASN-301, the Turkish Gargi, and of course the infamous Iranian Shahed 131 and Shahed 136, the latter produced under Russian license as the Garand-II. These systems typically have ranges from 400 kilometers to over 2,000, warheads of 15 to 100 kilograms, and these are mainly strategic assets designed for deep strike attrition campaigns against high-value fixed infrastructure from long standoff distances. Unit cost in this tier is deliberately held down to enable volume employment. The Iranian Shahed 136 runs at roughly $20,000 to $50,000 per unit, with Russia's license-produced Garand-II priced around $80,000 per unit. The categories matter because they tell you what a given system was built to do before you start asking how well it did it. A $25,000 drone built for a 10% hit rate against strategic infrastructure at 2,500 kilometers is solving a different problem than a $70,000 drone built for precision anti-radiation strikes against integrated air defense at 300 kilometers. Comparing them head-to-head without accounting for category is a mistake. With that in hand, the YIHA-III. The primary reporting on the YIHA-III's internals is thin. What we know for sure is that it is a joint venture between NASTP and Baykar, that the end user can launch it from a runway, and that it was developed for swarm attacks. The payload, range, and endurance have not been disclosed. Open source reporting from specialist defense outlets has variously described the YIHA-III as built around a tubular airframe carrying a warhead derived from Roketsan's anti-tank missile family, specifically the OMTAS medium-range or UMTAS long-range tandem charge heat warheads. These outlets presumably draw on industry sources, briefings, and photographs of recovered airframes. But the specific provenance of the internal design claims is not documented in the public record I've been able to access. It has also been consistently reported that the warhead is in the 10-kilogram class and uses shaped charge heat physics. Heat warheads on loitering munitions are, it turns out, entirely common. The American Switchblade 600, the Israeli Hero 120, and Russian Lancet III all carry heat warheads. So does the Iranian Shahed 136, which reportedly carries a 40-kilogram shaped charge warhead. Heat warheads are widely used across the loitering munition class when the mission is anti-armor, point target destruction, or punching through the roof of a hardened structure. A 40-kilogram shaped charge warhead delivered into an oil refinery or a military storage depot can do serious damage. The point worth flagging about the YIHA-III specifically is simply that its warhead is small. A 10-kilogram heat charge is at the lower end of the medium-range class. Against the SEAD target set, radars, SAM launchers, forward operating bases, a shaped charge jet of that yield has to land cleanly on a point target to produce a meaningful kill. Purpose-built anti-radiation loitering munitions use larger blast fragmentation warheads with pre-fragmented casings to generate area effect against exposed, unarmored targets. The Israeli Harops carries a 23-kilogram blast fragmentation warhead for that reason. The larger Shahed 136 can get away with heat because it has 4 times the explosive yield. This raises the question of what Pakistan actually had in inventory for suppressing the Indian air defenses in May 2025. The answer was a mix of tools, none of which were perfectly suited to a compressed timeline SEAD campaign. Air-launched cruise missiles, expensive at roughly $1 million per unit. Tactical ballistic missiles like the Fatah-1, heavy payload, medium range, but inventory constrained and escalation sensitive. Fighter-delivered glide bombs require the fighter to survive long enough to reach release range, which is not always possible against the modern integrated air defense network. Fighter-delivered standoff missiles, such as the CM-400 AKG, as proven in May 25, can prove particularly effective, but costly. And the loitering munitions, cheaper per unit, able to loiter over a target area waiting for an emitter to activate, and deployable in volume without the political footprint of cruise missile use. The YIHA-III was the medium-range workhorse in that mix, the only one built specifically as a loitering munition rather than a fighter-dependent standoff weapon. Operation Bunyan-un-Marsoos. Operation Bunyan-un-Marsoos was Pakistan's retaliatory campaign following India's Operation Sindoor. Pakistan's drone deployment was not a YIHA-III only affair. Pakistan reportedly launched between 300 and 400 drones total across roughly 36 target locations along the western border. The drone wave included SEAD, Songars, Bayraktar TB2s, Chinese CH-4s and Winglong 2s, indigenous Barracks and Sharper 2s, Chinese CH-901 loitering munitions, and additional foreign-sourced systems. Target types range from radar installations to airfields to missile storage facilities in Indian Kashmir, Punjab, and Rajasthan. The YIHA-III's specific role in that wave was suppression of enemy air defenses, Indian radar installations, SAM sites, and forward operating bases. The numerical accounting of how that went is unreliable in both directions. India claimed over 600 Pakistani drones neutralized. Pakistan has not publicly confirmed its own loss figures. Both sides have clear incentives to publicize favorable numbers, and neither side's claim has been independently verified. Treat the headline figures from both capitals as contested at best. What the combat record does independently confirm through the forensic pipeline run by India's Border Security Force laboratories in Delhi and Amritsar is that Turkish origin YIHA-III and Songar wreckage were recovered inside Indian territory, disassembled, and subjected to systematic reverse engineering. That tells you Pakistani drones, including YIHA-IIIs, came down inside India, probably through soft kill measures. The absence of other evidence becomes informative here. In the public record currently available, there is no independently documented case of a YIHA-III strike inflicting meaningful damage on a high-value Indian asset. No destroyed S-400 launcher, no cratered Akash-Tir node, no disabled Barak 8 system confirmed by independent imagery or neutral assessment. Images and videos from the May 2025 engagement show YIHA-IIIs reaching Indian targets, but the outcomes of those specific strikes are not documented in sources this brief can draw on. The most reasonable inference is that Pakistan's YIHA-III employment in May 2025 served at best to saturate the Indian counter-UAS environment and absorb interceptor inventory, rather than to achieve the kind of targeted air defense suppression that a purpose-built SEAD platform with the right warhead would have been designed to produce. If any YIHA-III did destroy a militarily valuable target, the evidence for it has not surfaced publicly. Whether that counts as failure depends on what Pakistani planners had actually expected the YIHA-III to do. Against the stated Indian claim of over 600 neutralized, it looks like a rout. Against the saturation attrition benchmark, it seems to have worked commendably. However, the more analytically useful question is not whether Pakistan's YIHA-IIIs failed individually. It is whether the YIHA-III was asked to do in May 25 matches what the loitering munition class is actually good at. Given what was happening on the other side of the border in the same week, and given what the global record since 2022 has shown about loitering munitions in general. The global record of loitering munitions. Starting with the other side of the border, open source analysis documents approximately 29 intact Israeli IAI Harops recoveries inside Pakistani territory. Drones that came down more or less in one piece, suggesting non-kinetic defeat rather than kinetic destruction. That matters because the Harops is not the YIHA-III. It is longer ranged, heavier warheaded, built by Israel Aerospace Industry, a firm with decades of anti-radiation loitering munition development, and designed from the start as a purpose-built SEAD platform. It is by every reasonable indication a more expensive, more mature, and more purpose-built weapon than the YIHA-III. And still, it was coming down in Pakistani fields at the same time Pakistani loitering munitions were coming down in Indian ones. So if the YIHA-III's attrition had been driven by narrowly Pakistani or Turkish factors, only one of these systems would have been failing that week. Both were. That observation on its own does not prove the loitering munition class is in trouble, but it is a starting point for asking what the global record actually says about what this class of weapon is good at. For that, we turn to the Ukrainian theater. In Ukraine, Russian Shahed and Geron-class drones have worked. Ukraine is the most intensely contested drone theater in the world right now, and Ukrainian air defense combines Western and legacy Soviet SAMs, NATO-supplied early warning, dense tactical electronic warfare, and a domestically developed interceptor drone ecosystem. A quantitative study of the war, drawing on datasets from Oryx, Cypri, Akled, and CNAS, finds that Ukrainian interception rates against Russian Shaheds have declined from 89% in the earlier phase of the war to 70% as the Russian saturation campaign has evolved. That decline is not only a story of the Shaheds getting better, it is a story of Ukrainian air defense being progressively degraded by the Shahed Doctrine. Interceptor inventories drawn down faster than they can be replenished, radars and launchers worn out or destroyed, crews fatigued, and defensive coverage thinned out over time. The cost exchange figure, a Patriot to Shahed ratio of approximately 190 to 1 against the defender, is what makes that degradation sustainable for the attacker. Every Shahed intercepted cost the defender roughly 190 times what the drone cost to build, and the 30% that gets through reach strategic infrastructure, power grids, oil refineries, logistics hubs, and do cumulative damage that runs into the billions. The interceptor depletion is the slow bleed, the infrastructure damage is the fast one. Both pressures feed into each other, and together they are what makes the saturation doctrine work. The 2026 Iran-US-Israel conflict has sharpened the picture further. According to a 2026 analysis, Iran fired approximately 2,000 one-way attack drones during the first 5 days of Operation Epic Fury, which began on the 28th of February 2026. It was assessed that Tehran was on pace to sustain 4,000 to 5,000 Shahed-class launches per month. Iranian drones targeted US and allied bases across the Gulf and Israel. The cost exchange figures are stark, the Shahed 136 at $20,000 to $50,000 per unit, forcing Patriot interceptors at approximately $4 million each, Iron Dome Tamir interceptors at $80,000 to $100,000 per round, and THAAD engagements at $13 million each. The Iranian approach is explicitly designed to bankrupt the entire defensive architecture concurrently. The Gulf picture is a Ukrainian picture, compressed into a shorter time frame and spread across more defenders. The broader observation is that low-cost, attritable drones are not failing against peer air defense. They are working at enough scale over enough time against the right target set to impose real strategic effects. The conditions that make the saturation doctrine work are specific: sufficient volume of launches, sufficient time for cumulative pressure, a cost exchange ratio that favors the attacker, and a target set strategic infrastructure that can absorb high interception rates and still produce meaningful damage. Pakistan's deployment of the YIHA-III in May 2025 had almost none of these conditions. The 72-hour conflict window meant there was no time for iterative pressure or cumulative effect. The 300 to 400 total Pakistani drones spread across at least half a dozen platforms meant there was no sufficient volume of YIHA-IIIs specifically. For comparison, a Russian Shahed campaign launches roughly that many in a single day, combined with other loitering munitions and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. Also, in May 2025, the target set was not strategic infrastructure at all. It was SEAD, Indian radars, SAM launchers, and forward operating bases. Discrete, hardened, actively defended military targets against which a 30% leakage rate produces no cumulative damage and no strategic effect. The YIHA-III was asked to do a job the saturation doctrine is not designed for, on a timeline the doctrine cannot operate on, at a volume the doctrine cannot work with. However, the next generation loitering munitions seem to suggest that the short, high-intensity SEAD role is potentially within the loitering munitions wheelhouse. What a next generation loitering munition looks like. A brief note on terminology. The first generation / next generation framing I'm using is my own analytical shorthand, not established in academic language. What the literature describes is architectural divergence, systems built around GPS and operator data links versus systems built around onboard AI and GPS-denied navigation. I'm compressing that divergence into generations for convenience. An example of a next-generation medium-range loitering munition is the Helsing HX-II, a German-built system that Ukraine has ordered in quantities of between 6,000 and 10,000 units. On range, the HX-II is in the same class as the YIHA-III, approximately 100 kilometers. On warhead size, it is actually smaller, roughly 4 kilograms. On weight, it is around 12 kilograms minimum takeoff mass. However, the real difference between the HX-II and what came before it is not in specifications, it's actually in the architecture itself. The HX-II runs onboard artificial intelligence for target identification and loiter management, with the human operator kept in the loop for lethal engagement decision. In GPS-denied environments, jamming, spoofing, signal loss, it navigates using onboard map matching against its own sensor feed rather than falling back to inertial dead reckoning and drifting off course. It is networked through Helsing's Ultra Command platform, which allows a single operator to supervise a swarm rather than hand-fly individual units. And its flight control stack is built from the ground up around the assumption that the electronic environment is actively contested. What the HX2 addresses is the set of vulnerabilities the May 2025 conflict exposed in systems like the YIHA-III and the Harop. The commercial-grade flight controller problem is addressed by purpose-built military electronics. The GPS dependency is addressed by onboard map matching. The data link vulnerability is addressed by software-defined autonomy that keeps the mission running when the operator link goes down. The single operator per drone limitation is addressed by ultra-swarm networking. Every architectural weakness the YIHA-III and Harops share is addressed at the design level in the HX2. Baykar has drawn architecturally similar conclusions through its own next-generation network. In March 2026, Baykar unveiled the K2, a larger, longer-range kamikaze platform with an 800 kg maximum takeoff weight, a 200 kg warhead, over 2,000 kilometers of range, and AI-driven navigation designed for GPS-denied environments. The K2 and the HX2 are in different weight and range classes. The K2 is a long-range strategic attrition platform closer to the Shahed class role. The HX2 is a medium-range multi-role closer to the YIHA-III's class. But they have arrived at architecturally similar answers to the same underlying problem: onboard AI, GPS-denied navigation, software-defined resilience. So what's next for Pakistan? The YIHA-III is not individually a failed system. It simply was used in a role it was not optimized for, on a timeline its doctrine was not designed for, against a target set that did not reward its employment. The platform will continue to have useful applications in counter-militant operations and long-duration attritional campaigns of the kind the saturation doctrine is built around. The lesson for Pakistan is not that the YIHA-III is a bad weapon. It is that the YIHA-III is not the weapon Pakistan needed for the specific mission it assigned to it in May 2025, and that the architectural generation the YIHA-III represents, GPS-dependent, commercial controller-based, medium-range multi-role, is one the broader industry is actively moving beyond. That leaves Pakistan with 4 realistic options for closing the specific capability gap May 2025 exposed. Option 1. A direct purchase of a next-generation Western loitering munition. Most concretely, the Helsing HX2 or a comparable European system. This would give Pakistan onboard AI target identification, GPS-denied map matching navigation, ultra-swarm networking, and a battle-tested procurement record from the Ukrainian theatre, the complete architectural package the YIHA-III lacks. The problem is that this option is politically unavailable. Germany does not sell top-tier loitering munitions to Pakistan, and the broader European export control environment for next-generation drone technology is tightening rather than loosening. Option 2. Deepening the Baykar partnership. This is where most of Pakistan's current effort is ongoing, and it is where the details matter most. Baykar's relevant product lines fall into 3 groups. The Bayraktar TB2 and Kinchi are armed surveillance UAVs, not loitering munitions, and are already in Pakistani service in substantial numbers. The YIHA-III is the medium-range multi-role platform this episode is about, co-developed with NASTP in Pakistani service, currently undergoing Block 2 upgrades. The Kamankesh line is Baykar's newer family of AI-capable air-launched mini-cruise munitions, closely related to NASTP's own Kagam V3, and more recently the K2, unveiled in March 2026, is Baykar's large, long-range strategic attrition platform with onboard AI and GPS-denied navigation. The NASTP Baykar YIHA-III Block 2 upgrade program is working on improvements to GPS resilience, engine cooling, structural integrity, and autopilot software, essentially taking the learnings from the May 2025 conflict and applying them. Block 2 helps more specifically with fewer reliability failures from environmental causes, better performance against the specific GPS jamming Pakistan encountered in May 2025. As mentioned, also in the Baykar pipeline is the Kamankesh 2, which is reported to be the NASTP Kagam V3. With the Kagam V3, NASTP already has a Baykar pedigree air-launched AI-capable munition in production, The Kagan V3 could in principle be employed in a SEAD role, an air-launched, AI-capable cruise missile-adjacent munition. However, this would likely be at a much higher per-unit cost than a purpose-built, medium-range SEAD loitering munition, which crucially means it cannot be deployed in the volume that the role typically calls for. It will be a small number of expensive effectors against a defended target set rather than a saturation tool. So overall, what the Baykar option realistically gives Pakistan is continuity. It preserves the existing Baykar relationship, keeps NASTP in the institutional loop, provides incremental upgrades to the YIHA-III, and avoids the political and technical difficulty of pivoting to a newer supplier. From what is publicly available, it does not, however, give Pakistan a purpose-built SEAD platform. And this is the critical point for Pakistan. Suppression of enemy air defense is a time-sensitive, precision-dependent mission. You need to find an emitting radar, fly to it while it's still emitting, and destroy it before it shuts down or moves. That mission profile is best served by a medium-range loitering munition. And critically, this is something that is missing from the current Baykar portfolio. Option 3. A Chinese next-generation loitering munition acquisition. China's drone and loitering munition industry is mature. The publicly known Chinese systems fall into three broad categories that matter for Pakistan's gap. At the tactical end, the CH-901 tube launch system is already in Pakistani service. At the medium-range end, the WS-43, a turbojet-powered medium-range platform in the 60km class. And at the long-range end, the ASN-301, a Chinese anti-radiation loitering munition roughly analogous to the Israeli Harpy. Of those, the ASN-301 is the system that would come closest to filling the specific capability gap May 2025 exposed. A purpose-built anti-radiation platform from a supplier Pakistan already has working institutional channels to. This munition meets the SEAD requirements of Pakistan almost perfectly. Correct range, terminal guidance, and purposefully built for SEAD. However, Pakistan already imports roughly 81% of its arms from China. A further Chinese procurement deepens the exact dependency the Turkish pivot was designed to hedge against. Option 4. Indigenous development through NASTP, NESCOM, and the private sector. This is the most strategically attractive option on paper and the hardest to deliver on near-term timelines, but it is not a blank slate. Pakistan has several programs in development that are potentially relevant to closing the gap. At the medium range end, the GIDS Blaze 50, with 180 km range, 20 kg warhead, and piston powered, sits in the same operational class as the YIHA-III. The Blaze 75 extends that to 500 km with a 30 kg warhead and gasoline propulsion, moving it toward the lower end of the long-range tier. At the long-range end, the GIDS Sarkash is a turbojet-powered system with a claimed 1,000 km range and a 50 kg warhead, a genuine Shahed-class strategic attrition platform built domestically. Neither the Blaze series nor the Sarkash has disclosed its seeker or guidance architecture publicly, but a blast fragmentation warhead combined with an anti-radiation seeker, the combination that makes the system genuinely useful for SEAD, is not architecturally out of reach for any of these platforms. The seeker is a component choice, not a fundamental redesign. The harder question is not whether Pakistan could build something capable, it is whether Pakistan could build it in sufficient numbers to matter. The Sarkash's turbojet propulsion gives it speed and survivability advantages over piston-powered systems. The turbojet engines are significantly more expensive and harder to produce at scale than the motorcycle-derived piston engines that make the Shahed 136 cheap enough to field in the thousands. The Blaze series uses more accessible propulsion but sits at the lower end of the performance envelope. Kua's characterization of Pakistan's LM industry as design-heavy, production-light applies most sharply here. The designs exist on paper and in prototype, but scaled production of any of these systems to the volumes that saturation doctrine requires has not been demonstrated. The institutional question compounds the production one. NASTP and NESCOM operate on parallel tracks with imperfect coordination. Building a coherent program that takes a Blaze or Sarkash class platform from prototype to mass production, equips it with the right seeker, and fields it in operationally meaningful numbers requires the kind of integrated institutional effort that Pakistan's loitering munition ecosystem has not yet demonstrated. So what is the conclusion? The YIHA-III's combat record in May 2025 is in the end less interesting than what it reveals. A weapon that crashed in Pakistani fields and came down intact in Indian ones didn't fail because Baykar designed it badly or because NASTP assembled it poorly. It failed because it was a first-generation GPS-dependent system meeting a pair-integrated air defense network, which is exactly what the Israeli Harop did on the other side of the border in the same week, at roughly twice the price. What happens next is the more consequential question. The architectural answer is not in dispute. Onboard AI, GPS-denied navigation, purpose-built electronics, and the right seeker for the right mission. Pakistan has multiple options in order to pursue this objective, each with its own drawbacks. It can turn to the Turks, the Chinese, or go it alone. However, questions arise on the production scale or institutional coherence to close the gap indigenously, and its external options each come with a dependency it has spent a decade trying to reduce. If you found this analysis useful, subscribing helps. More on Pakistani and South Asian defense to come in the following videos.